we started off this talk series with the talk from Johnny, who's here, who gave a sort of nice characterization of like identifiability as being the sort of intersection of assumptions on the latent distribution and assumptions on the generator function or rendering function, whatever you want to call it, the mapping from latent to observation. And then we saw a sort of series of papers that made different sets of assumptions and which led to different identifiability results. So we had Yixing Wang and Jiaqi Zhang, who both talked about different ways that if you have access to multiple interventions, so interventional data, and you make a polynomial assumption on G, then you can prove identifiability of the latents. And you needed sort of enough interventions, and there were some trade-offs between the two different approaches in terms of how many interventions you needed. Then we saw Gautam's talk last week, where we made this sort of additional assumption of Gaussian latents, and again having access to multiple interventions. But this then allowed us to drop the constraints on G. This week, we can go the opposite direction. We're going to not require many interventions, but we're going to have sparse dependence between the latents and the observations X via Spark and Slab prior. And so this is going to be a sort of much more constrained G, but then not require sort of multiple interventions, and we have sort of relatively fewer assumptions on the latents. And so it's sort of the other side of the coin, and it's a nice example of how sparsity can be leveraged to achieve identifiability. And we're going to see some more talks in this space of leveraging sparsity in the next couple of weeks. On that note, next week we're not going to have a talk because it's the ICML deadline and expect attendance to be pretty bad. So we'll skip next week and we'll continue the following week. Okay, so I can stop sharing my screen, and Gemma, you can take it away.
Great, thank you. Okay, so everyone can see my slides just fine? Perfect, great. Thanks, Jason, for the great introduction and for the invitation to talk today. So I'm excited to chat about this approach to identifiable representation learning using sparsity. So Jason already gave a nice framing of where this work is situated in the space, but I'll just reiterate some of this framing of how our work fits into the broader picture of causal representation learning, which has been a focus of this talk series. So as we know, we have these days really high dimensional data. So in genomics, for example, we may have single cell RNA sequencing data from thousands of genes and thousands of cells. And this data gives us this sort of very granular picture of what's going on in the cell and underlying biological processes. And so our goal is to take this really high dimensional data and try to understand something about the biology, the processes, the science underlying what's happening here and what we're observing. So in the framing of causal representation learning, we have this high dimensional observed data, these gene expression levels, for example, these X's here. And we want to infer something about these latent processes which describe how this data is generated or what drives the coordinated expression among these particular data points. So if we see a bunch of genes that all coordinate at the same time, their expression levels all happen at the same time, we might expect that they are driven by the same kind of underlying biological process happening in the cell. And so this is the goal of causal representation learning, is to try to get at this, this underlying processes describing our high dimensional data. Of course, this is a very difficult problem. We don't observe these latent variables that describe how multiple of our data points coordinate. Moreover, we don't observe, anything about the connections between these latents and our observed data, or the connections among the latents themselves. So it's, as I'm sure we're all aware, a very difficult problem. So we can sort of decompose this into, problem one is identifying these latent variables. Like, can we come up with these variables that describe how the variation in our data is coordinated? And secondly, can we then, given that, identify the causal graph? So how these latent processes then interact with each other or cause each other. So in this framing of causal representation learning, we're just focused on this first problem of how do we identify the latent variables. So in that way, we're not so much focused on the question of causality, but more just from a statistical identifiability problem. Can we actually identify these latent variables, and what assumptions are we going to make in order to identify these? And so, as Jason mentioned, our approach leverages sparsity to identify these latent variables. And it's a particular kind of sparsity that is in the mappings from this latent space, these latent variables, to the observed data. So it's sparsity among these edges from the latent Z to the observed data, X. So as we've had in the last couple of talks in this series, trying to get at these latent variables is a big identifiability problem. If we assume some deep generative models, so we have our unobserved Z, I'll refer to them as factors. We can also think of them as our latent representation. We assume that it's passed through some flexible function f, or the generator function, to produce our observed data x. So within this model, if we're trying to learn something about this f, learn something about the distribution of our latent factors, we have this big indeterminacy problem of, we could equivalently write this model as h inverse of z for some function h, and then have the function from the latent space to the observed data be f composed with h. So the problem here is that these two setups are observationally equivalent. Based on just the data that we've observed, we can't tell the difference between, have we learned h inverse of z, have we learned z? And so this is a massive problem for trying to understand anything about the underlying processes that are driving the variation in our data. We have multiple solutions that we can't tell the difference from just based on our data alone. We need to make further assumptions in order to actually say anything meaningful about our problem. So how do we think about ways to get rid of this indeterminacy? So as Jason mentioned, Johnny has a great paper outlining in great detail how these sources of indeterminacy come to be. But what we can do to constrain them is put constraints on either the distribution of the latent variables or on the functional form of f, our generator function. And so why is this helpful? So if these are our two sets of solutions that are observationally equivalent, this f and z, or the probability distribution on z, and then f composed with h, and then h inverse of z is also an equivalent solution, then if we place constraints, then any of these f composed with h also need to satisfy the same constraints as the original f function, and vice versa for our distribution of z. So if we assume, for example, that f has some kind of sparse structure, then this other equivalent solution must also have that kind of sparse structure. And so this limits what h can be. It limits the possible solutions that are then observationally equivalent from our observed data. So we've seen some great talks on ways to place constraints on either the distribution of our latents or our generator functions. But just as a non-exhaustive literature review, there have been many papers that place constraints on the distribution of Z, either from assuming access to some auxiliary data about the latent variables, by assuming that there are some data augmentations. So, potentially you have paired data where you're assuming that some of the latent processes are the same across the pairs and some of them are different. There are papers that assume access to temporal dependencies where the latents can only change a certain amount over time, and so that constrains what they can be. There are papers that consider different priors on Z. So this Kiefer et al. Paper, for example, assumes a Gaussian mixture model prior. And then we've seen some talks on using interventional data. So if you're actually able to change the distribution of Z, how does then that affect your learning and place constraints on this distribution? On the other hand, there are also a number of papers that place constraints on the function class. So, for example, assuming some kind of sparse structure, assuming some kind of independent mechanisms, conformal maps, or some kind of structure like an additive decoder. So our work fits into this criterion of placing constraints on F, and we use a specific kind of constraint on F, which corresponds to this idea of anchor features, which, as I'll talk about, has shown up in a variety of literature, including topic modeling and various other areas, and we're leveraging for this deep generative model situation. Okay, so just as a summary of our proposal, the sparse variational autoencoder is we introduce sparsity into the flexible factor to feature mapping. So as I mentioned before, we're looking at the edges from Z to X and placing sparsity there. So we're going to fit this model with a variational autoencoder to get flexibility in terms of learning nonlinear representations. Another benefit is that we get some measure of interpretability in that we can inspect these edges from the latent space to the observed data, and that gives us a sense of what these latent variables are actually encoding. And finally, we also get identifiability under, of course, certain assumptions. So just as a roadmap for the rest of my talk, I'll first provide some intuition from the linear case to show how sparsity is important there and how we can leverage it in the nonlinear deep generative model case. I'll then introduce our model and our identifiability results, and then discuss some of our experimental results as well. So we can consider the linear factor analysis model as a linear representation learning method to get intuition for the identifiability problem, as the identifiability problem is also appears here in this sort of like simplest case. So in the linear factor analysis model, so we have our observed data here, X with N rows that correspond to our samples or our individuals. And we have G columns, which corresponds to our features. It could be like, different genes and their gene expression levels. So we assume that this matrix can be decomposed into this Z matrix of factors or our representations. So for each of our rows here, our samples, we get some low dimensional representation of it in the rows of Z. And the mapping or the generator function is this loadings matrix B that maps from this latent space back to our observed data space. Of course, we don't observe either Z or this loadings matrix B. And even in this simple case, we have the identifiability problem show up. So we can introduce any rotation matrix here such that just the rotation matrix times its transpose is the identity. And we have then that this Z times the rotation matrix and B times the rotation matrix are observationally equivalent. And we, essentially then can't decide a priori without any further assumptions which of these to choose. And of course, once we're timesing these matrices by rotation, we're mixing the coordinates where, if we had this structure of Z1 and Z2 and Z3, we're now just mixing. And so now instead of Z1, we might have like Z1, some linear combination of Z1 and Z2 and Z3. And so we're really, quote unquote, entangling these kind of latents that we're trying to learn. So how does sparsity help us in this situation? Well, we can see here that if we're assuming some kind of sparsity on this loadings matrix B, then this really limits what kinds of rotation matrix are possible, because we can see in this situation that timesing B by this rotation matrix gives us a dense matrix here. So where by having some kind of constraint of sparsity, you're saying that, okay, well, there are with a specific kind of sparsity, then there are no rotation matrix that will preserve that kind of sparsity. And so you can eliminate those possible solutions, and then you resolve the identifiability problem. So what kind of sparsity are we looking for that can eliminate these these rotation matrices that give us this issue? So if we have this specific kind of structure called anchor features, then we can get identifiability. We can limit the set of rotation matrices that are possible and get a unique solution. So what is an anchor feature? An anchor feature is a feature or a column of your observed data. So this could be gene J, for example. And this gene or this feature depends only on one coordinate of the latent space. So this is sort of an anchor for that particular coordinate or factor, that Z1 in this case, because it's only a function of that Z1. So this anchor structure is sparse in that this loadings matrix will have just one non-zero value, and the rest of the column here will be zeros. So why is this helpful? So this sort of in our quest of learning these latent factors, it seems like just such a difficult problem to get at. What are these latents that we don't observe from this high dimensional data? But here we're seeing that, okay, this assumption means that we've got columns of our data that are essentially proxies of our latent factors. And so if we can find these proxies in our data matrix, then we're sort of anchoring to those proxies, and then we can learn the structure from there. So this idea of anchors has shown up in topic modeling for bag of words, representations of text, and more recently in linear factor analysis in this Bing et al. Paper from the Annals of Statistics. Okay, so and just as another example, so this could be like an anchor feature for a second factor, for example. And so the main takeaway from our paper is, how can we generalize this idea of anchors, which has been so helpful in the linear case, to the nonlinear representation learning case? So with that intuition about sparsity being built, let's talk about how we incorporate this idea into the deep generative model setup. So from before, we had this setup where we introduce our latent factor Z, you pass them through some decoder or generative function F and produce the data. So the change that we're making here is that before passing our latent factors through this generator, we're masking them with this W matrix or W vector. So for each of our features, so this would be, gene J for sample I. So we have a gene specific masking vector that says that for all of gene J, only a subset of the latent dimensions are going to be used to reconstruct this gene. And this is across all of our samples here. So we can view this masking matrix W as analogous to this loading matrix from the linear situation, where we're getting that anchor structure in this masking matrix W in a similar way to in the loading matrix from the linear case. So as another example, so for a different gene, gene L would use a different subset of the latent factors to generate that. And so this is where the sparsity in our connections come in. So another way to view our setup here is that in the mapping from this latent space C, so from the first factor and the second factor to the observed data x1 to x5 here, we have these sparse connections. In contrast to a usual deep generative model where every dimension of your data is allowed, or just depends on each dimension of your latent space. So this is our sparsity, as I said, in these edges. And a nice property of this is that, oh, is there a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you need to know the sparsity, like I know you don't need to know what the anchor features are.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, do you need to know how sparse these connections are, or what is the sort of qualifier?
Yeah, so we as you said, we don't need to know what the anchor features are. We just need to assume that there are, for each factor, so for Z1 here, we need at least two features so 2 dimensions of our X that depend only on that factor. So in this case, we'd have X1 and X2 are anchors for Z1, X4 and X5 are anchors for Z2. And yeah, so we need these 2 for each of our factors. For the connections elsewhere, we don't have any assumptions on how sparse they are. So what you can think about in this W matrix, we just assume that essentially there is some support that's like the identity, like 2 identity matrices, and then everything below that is can be like any kind of sparse structure.
I see. Can you encode that as a prior, like that you just want 2 2 non-zeros and then that form of sparsity? Does the Sparse prior that you guys use, does that exactly get that, or is it sort of stronger than that?
So that's a great question. And so our prior is weaker than this condition in that, so where we're just putting like this sparsity on every element of W that doesn't necessarily correspond to the anchor sparsity. So I guess this is the gap between like the theory and then in practice what we do, but the prior that we have to actually fit the model drives the model to the to put more mass on these kind of solutions that have this kind of anchor structure. So yeah, that's a great question, and maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the actual model and that gap between like the theory and the practice. Yeah. Okay, great questions. Really anticipating the rest of the talk. Okay, so yeah, as I said, we have these sparse connections, and from these sparse connections, we get some interpretability as well. In that, if we learn these anchors, for instance, if this is, gene 1 and gene 2, and we know something about gene 1 and gene 2, we can say, okay, well, Z1 or Z1 must comprise some biological process that acts on these genes. If these genes are like very specific to specific biological process, then this, Z1 we can say captures that biological process. Okay, so now let's talk about identifiability. So as we've been talking about, in general, identifiability is, if we have 2 parameters that have equal likelihood, then these parameters must be equal. We relax this a little bit in the same way that many papers in this area do, in that we don't necessarily care about getting, Z1 or Z1 squared, as long as we've disentangled, we don't have some linear combination of Z1 and Z, or non-linear combination Z1 and Z2 and Z3. We essentially just want to get the coordinates right. We want to get, make sure we've disentangled the columns, as opposed to getting like the exact mapping correct. So we want to avoid these kind of rotation situations where you're really mixing up these dimensions. So as I said, the goal is, getting this identifiability up to coordinate-wise transform. So we don't necessarily care about like the individual coordinates if, as I said, like Z1 or Z1 squared. We show that we get identifiability under the following assumptions. So the first is this anchor assumption that I've been talking about. And more specifically, we assume that for each factor, so each of these latent dimensions, there are at least two features that depend only on that factor and moreover have the same mapping to that factor. Having the same mapping, this may seem like a strong assumption, but there might be situations where we might anticipate this. If you have movie ratings data and you have two movies and your latent space or your latent dimension is the genre, you might expect that you might rate two movies like very similarly. And we found in our experiments that we seem to still get good results when we relax this from being like the same mapping to just the same like functional form of the mapping. It'd be interesting to have future work trying to relax the assumption somewhat. And yeah.
If this is if is like a neural network, well, you're constrained to only use particular coordinates. How do you constrain this to be the same mapping? So like Z1 is just the same. It's the same neural network on sort of just say Z1 and Z2 are my two. Z1 is my anchor feature. Is my latent, and then I have X1 and X2 are the two anchor features. Do they have? They surely don't take on the same value then, or do they? Would they take on exactly?
So you're asking great questions. Again, this is sort of the gap between the theory and in practice. In practice, we're allowing them to have different mappings, mostly to see like how can we relax this assumption and like can we still, in our experiments, get at the kind of structure, like the true latents. This is again something that we need for the proof to go through, but we think that can be relaxed in experiments. In our model, we don't actually have this exact constraint, and still finds that it can do a decent job.
Okay, so sort of for the proof to go through, you saying X1 and X2 take on exactly the same values, assuming they're the so they're the sort of pair of anchor features associated with Z1, and they take on exactly the same values, but in practice the sort of sparsity seems to be enough.
Exactly, and we're allowing like different, right, exactly. And there's also like additive noise as well that so it's just on the mean.
So they share the same mean, but they can have the same, they're different realizations. Added to noise. Good. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Great. And so as I've said, the anchor features don't need to be known in advance. Okay, so our next assumption is on sort of the scale of the neural network. Basically what this is saying is that if you perturb a latent factor, the anchor features are going to be perturbed more than the non-anchor features. And this sort of is like, okay, well, if you have all of the factors bar one held fixed and you're varying the factor, then the things that depend only on that factor are going to vary more than the ones that also depend on other stuff that are held fixed. It's a bit technical, but we show that it's satisfied by neural networks with ReLU activations and independent weights. Of course, it would be nice if we could extend this to non-independent weights as we might get after training, but it's nice at least that to start with, we have these, the networks that we're using satisfy this assumption. And the other assumption that we have is on the covariance of the factors. So the variance of any individual factor needs to be greater than its covariance with any other factor. So I like to think of this as sort of, we need to see a factor varying more in itself than, its covariance with any other factor. If we're thinking about that, sort of toy example in machine learning of if you only ever see cows on grass and camels on desert, then, there's no way for your model actually to tell the difference between the two. The covariance of cow and grass is so tightly, it's like, the same as the actual variance that you see in cows. And so like there's, if you're thinking about some kind of experimental design and needing, a balanced design, you're not actually seeing these like boxes being filled in your experimental design. And so, how can your model tease these apart? Okay. So just to give some intuition for our proof. So the idea is that the anchor features can be pinpointed from this covariance of our data. So the idea is that anchor features for the same factor will have like higher covariance with each other than the other feature. And so for this, we extended the result of Bing et al. For linear factor analysis to this nonlinear setting. And so from this point, if you're able to pinpoint these anchors, then as I mentioned before, you sort of have this structure in your W where your support is that you have like these two identity matrices, and then you have the rest of your W matrix is sort of unconstrained here. But what you're doing is like by having these anchors, you're fixing these dimensions of your latent space, and so you're removing this core problem of rotational invariance, and that's what gives you identifiability up to that coordinate-wise transform. Okay, so how do we fit this model? So now we're moving from the theory results to what we do in practice, and so here we can chat more about some of those questions that Jason had earlier. So our model is, we use fairly standard prior structures. So, Gaussian prior on our Z. I should say as well that in our results, we only require that assumption on the variance and the covariance of Z and not necessarily like the Gaussianity, but we fit this model having this Gaussian prior on our lanes Z. And in practice, we found that we were experimenting with, estimating this covariance matrix, but found that stability of training was just better if, in fact, we set that to the identity, even in the case where we had our underlying latents be correlated. It still ended up working fairly well in our ultimate variational approximation. So then we have our, our Z is generated by, as I said, masking our this feature-specific W vector, WJ. And to learn the support of this W matrix, we use this spike and slab lasso prior, which is a sparsity-inducing prior. So this prior is introduced by Rochefort and George, and it's a continuous spike and slab prior in that a priori, this WJK, this element of the W matrix, is drawn either from a Laplacian spike around 0 and so forced to be small, or from a Laplacian slab and allowed to be large. And so this prior is nice in that it sort of replicates this thresholding of the lasso, but has adaptivity in that it can shrink the small coefficients far more than the large coefficients, unlike the lasso, which just like applies the same shrinkage to everything. Okay, so then to learn the posterior distribution of our Z's, we fit a variational autoencoder. So I'm sure many of us are familiar with VAEs, but just in case not. So for the variational autoencoder, we assume this variational approximation where our latent Z are Gaussians with some flexible mean and variance parameters that depend on the data. And the parameters of these mu and sigma, which are neural networks, are learned as part of the optimization process. So we fit this objective function, which is the lower bound on the log likelihood, to learn both the parameters of F, here the generator or the decoder, as well as the parameters of our encoder or these mean of the variational approximation. So by forcing our data through this bottleneck to this low dimensional Z and then forcing it to reconstruct it, we're trying to get Z to contain as much information about our data as possible, but compressing it. So we use the same variational approximation for ZI as a usual VAE, and we use a variational EM algorithm for optimizing the parameters of the spike and slab lasso, the USW. So this ends up being, we do stochastic gradient ascent for the W and then the parameters of our neural network, and have these EM steps for the other parameters in the spike and slab lasso here. So yeah, just some comments based on earlier questions. So here we're not constraining F to be have the same mapping for the anchors. We're not presupposing anything about where the anchors are. We're just having this inductive bias of sparsity in this W to try and learn what are the anchor features. And we can look at the estimated W post hoc and see, okay, are we getting this kind of sparse structure that our theorem requires for identifiability? So any questions at this point? Mm-hmm.
It feels so. I haven't worked with the spike and slab. What is how do you control the sparsity through the prior? Is it which parameters are you changing to control the sparsity?
Yeah, so great question. So the lambda 1 and lambda 0 here are the parameters that sort of control the thresholding. So this lambda 1 is the slab part, and so this is small, it's like the inverse variance. And then lambda 0 is large to threshold things more. So with this kind of spike and slab lasso prior, we generally found good performance with setting the lambda 1 and lambda 0 to some fixed values that like lambda 1 being like 0.1 and lambda 0 being like 10 or something like that seem to work well. But in general, when I've been working with these priors, you can do these kind of annealing strategies where you start out with the spike and the slab being the same, and then gradually thresholding the spike to be more spiky. And you can kind of think about this as like an annealing strategy where your loss surface is smoother, and then you're gradually like making it more spiky, and it seems to work well. And so I tried that a little bit here. But yeah, it seems in some applications that just having these prefixed values or choosing them via cross-validation seems to work well as well.
Yeah, I guess that's sort of why I'm asking the question. Like you've got like pretty tight control over your capacity of your model based on the sparsity of the mask.
Mm-hmm.
It's nice about this.
Mm-hmm.
And so you sort of, I would imagine you can just kind of cross-validate this to be to say, you know, I want the sparsest model that still fits my data well. Actually, that still has good likelihood. But I was curious whether that's that is what you can do in practice, or whether this is sort of difficult to tune and difficult to get right.
Yeah, I found, so we sort of did a mix of just fixing them to these like default values, which seem to do fairly well in practice, and then some cross-validation as well we explored. But yeah, I guess, yeah, I feel like there's no sort of like one right answer. I feel like, you know, it'll be very problem dependent. And yeah, in a lot of cases, you might want to do that kind of thing, like find the sparsest model that has the best reconstruction error and this kind of trade-off between the two. Yeah. But yeah, but the nice thing about having this kind of beta Bernoulli prior as well is that you get some nice adaptivity to different levels of sparsity. So, you know, I've used these priors in kind of like bi-clustering methods where, you know, it found that you might have these like dense, you know, columns and sparse columns. And by having this kind of hierarchical prior, you know, it can actually adapt to, you know, oh, I need to make this column dense. I need to, you know, make this column sparse, just based on this, you know, hierarchical base model. So that is a nice feature about some of these as well. And at least in the linear case, Veronica Rushkova has and Ed George have some nice theorems showing like adaptivity to different sparsity levels as well. Okay, so I'll just briefly discuss some of our experimental results. So we look at a number of different experiments. First of all, like in a very simple setting, can we recover the true factors? How is our held out prediction? Like, do we suffer from having this kind of sparsity? We also look at domain adaptation and look at the interpretability of our model as well. So we compare our model with the usual VAE, the beta VAE, the output interpretable VAE, which has separate decoders for each of the different factors as opposed to just like this sparsity in the mapping. But you can kind of view it because you're having these separate decoders as some kind of sparsity. And then variational sparse coding, which places sparsity directly on the factors as opposed to these edges that we've been talking about. So we look at just this very simple example to start with, where we have 7 features, so 7 dimensions of our observed data and 2 underlying factors. So the true W matrix looks like this. The first 3 factors, the first 3 features depend on only the first factor. The next 3 depend on the second factor. And then the final one is some interaction of the 2 factors. So in the true data generating process, we have linear mappings for the first 2 features of X, depending on Z1, and then a quadratic mapping. And then for the next few, we again have linear, but then a sinusoidal mapping. And so we can see here, even in like the true model, we don't have this anchor property being the same of having like the exact same mapping. So here, you know, we just have the same functional form. So we have that these 2 are linear. That this is, you know, coefficient of 1 and coefficient of 2. So this is, you know, kind of saying like how much can we relax this assumption of having the exact same mapping. So what we find is that the sparsity does a nice job at getting at these latent factors and then the mapping as well. So we can see that, you know, plotting the observed data versus our learned factors, that where we're, you know, replicating this structure in the true model, and we can compare this with the VAE, which, you know, seems to get the second factor correct or almost correct, but then, you know, really can't learn this first factor here. So this interaction term between the Z1 and the Z2 is really sort of you know, messing up this VAE in that it's learning some kind of combination of the 2 as opposed to like disentangling these 2 latent factors. So we ran this experiment multiple times, looking at different correlation levels of our true underlying factors. So we vary them from not being correlated at all to having a correlation of 0.8. we plot the held out mean squared error. So of course, this is just the reconstruction error. It doesn't really concern identifiability at all. And so it's pretty constant across all these correlation levels. But then we look at the ground truth factor recovery via the DCI disentanglement score. And so we can see that the sparse VE compared to the VE in OVE and variational sparse coding recovers or has the best DCI score. The score degrades as our correlation in the factors increases, as we might expect. It's harder to disentangle these, but it's still doing fairly well up to even moderate like correlation levels among our factors, which is nice. We also look at held out prediction or reconstruction on the movie lens data set, which is the data set of ratings of movies by different users with 100,000 users and 300 movies. So looking at like held out negative log likelihood and normalized discounted cumulative gain, which kind of is like a ranked version of recall as well as recall, where we're doing better than these other methods. So we're not really sacrificing our reconstruction in terms of, by having this sparse penalty. And so we see a similar story with this peer read data set as well, consisting of word counts in paper abstracts. We also look at a domain adaptation experiment where we have half of the factors have the same distribution across the train and the test data, and half of them have a different distribution. So the idea here is that if we're able to like disentangle the coordinates, then on the test data, we should still do a decent job at least recovering those first ones. Whereas if you're completely entangling the coordinates, then maybe you'll do like a worse job just overall. You're not going to get anything right on the test data. So we look again at the average reconstruction loss on test data across different levels of difficulty, so increasing the distributional difference between the trained and the test data. Again, we can see that we're doing well here compared to all these other methods. We also look at interpretability. So, when we're observing this W matrix, are we actually learning something meaningful? So in the movie lens data set, especially, almost all of our factors of this W matrix, grouped movies in a meaningful way, but three particularly fun ones were this sci-fi factor, which contained movies like The Fifth Element and so on, a Pixar factor, and a action adventure, or actually probably maybe Harrison Ford factor here. And we could look and see that we have anchors for these factors as well, which makes sense, and have this kind of anchor structure. We also look at, I guess I've called it interpretability. It's more like downstream, uses of these representations. So we looked at this single cell RNA sequencing data set, where the cells are from different regions of the mouse cortex. So we extracted factors, and then on test data tried to predict the cell label from these factors. And we found that the sparse VE did very well at trying to predict these downstream cell labels. So the VAE was close. I should mention here, we always picked the VAE with the best beta if we're not comparing to the beta VAE. It means that we did the beta VAE and we just picked the one that was the best, and here it turned out just one was the best. So again, these are sort of close, but the nice thing about the sparse VAE as well is that we can inspect this W matrix and get some interpretability, and we found that the genes learned by the sparse VAE or like the groupings from this W matrix were enriched for 39 biological processes, all regarding different aspects of the brain that we might expect from mouse cortex cells. So the genes that we had were like meaningfully grouped together in a statistically significant way. So in conclusion, we developed the sparse VAE for representation learning. So it's flexible, interpretable, in that sense of edges that I talked about earlier, and identifiable as well. So with that, I'd like to thank my co-authors on this work, Dania Shrita, Yixin Wang, and Dave Bly. and happy to take any further questions.
Gemma, can you say a little bit more about the interpretability of the gene data, like how you identified that these genes were associated with this? Was this just like looking up in biological databases, or
Yeah, so there are R packages for gene ontology enrichment analysis. So from the W matrix, I just looked at, okay, like here are the ones with the genes that have non-zero support here. Let's plug them into this gene ontology enrichment analysis package, and then it says, like, are these statistically significantly grouped together? I think underlying it, there's some kind of like Fisher's test of, are you selecting things? Maybe, I can't remember the exact hypothesis test that's underlying it, but yeah, like, are you grouping these together more often than you would just by like chance random selection out of the subset of genes that you're considering as your like population.
okay.
So here, we had like, whatever 3,000 genes is our population, and like other ones that we selected from that, more significantly grouped together based on like, gene ontology, like annotations that are out there.
Gotcha.
But it is a pretty standard R package that like has this analysis software. Yeah.
There are two questions in the chat. Want me to read them to you, or you can just
Okay, I can read them. Do you see a connection between your work and structural sparsity constraints in nonlinear ICA? Yeah, so that's a great question. So that's something that I want to dig into a little bit more. So our sparse condition implies the sparse Jacobian that you see in those nonlinear ICA papers. My intuition is that in the reverse direction, there's like some kind of underlying, either like anchor assumption or something that's been common, at least in the linear factor analysis literature, is these kind of like upper triangular thing. So basically from like the 1950s or something, people were just like, oh, if we make this upper triangular, then we can, avoid all of these like rotation issues. And like having this kind of upper triangular structure is like sparse in some way, but it also corresponds to anchoring, and that you can like back out the rest of your factors, if you have this kind of upper triangular thing going on. Sorry, that was probably not super clear, but yeah, I think there's a really like strong connection, and it'd be very interesting to dig more into like how these sparsity constraints, especially as they've appeared in the linear literature and here, relate to the kind of sparse conditions that you see in these nonlinear ICA works and the independent mechanism stuff. So yeah, I think there's definitely work to be done there, which would be super interesting. So that's a great question. Next question. I didn't get how the inverse of Z with H connects to the rest of the presentation. Okay, so yeah, I guess the clearest connection for H is in that rotation matrix. So when things are linear, like the H that you can introduce that has this indeterminacy is exactly this rotation matrix P. So if basically the idea is that if this BP needs to satisfy the same sparsity constraints as B itself, then that limits what P can be. So here, obviously, this rotation matrix makes B not sparse anymore. So yeah, like I'm not sure if that helps, at least connecting the nonlinear H with the linear intuition, but it's the same kind of idea for the. I mean, we don't have like as nice visuals for the nonlinear case, but it's kind of the idea is that you're like limiting how the mixing function can behave, because like you've got this, these sparse connections that like pin down the dimensions of your latent space.
Johnny?
Yeah, I just had like a more open-ended question, which is, I noticed, I think your paper might be the only one to actually engage with the factor analysis literature from stats or psychometrics.
Mhm.
And there's sort of like there's been a super long history in that area, and then there's been all this recent work in ML. And I'm just wondering if you see any sort of more connections, or if you've just had like any comments on whether or not there are things that we can use from that older but very well developed literature there.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So yeah, related to the first question about connections to nonlinear ICA. I guess what I'm interested in is, yeah, there's been various ways in which people have used sparsity in the linear factor analysis case. There's the anchor assumption case, there's this upper triangular kind of structure. Yeah, so I feel like these kind of these sparse structures that people have been thinking about in linear factor analysis directly relate to the nonlinear case in these kind of sparse Jacobians in the generator, and so like bringing ideas from there into the situation is yeah, I feel like that is probably quite rich in terms of things that are available. Yeah, actually, when I was reading your paper, the triangular maps was super interesting because I felt like that directly connects to this upper triangular assumption that appears commonly in the linear case. So basically, in the linear case, they assume that this B matrix just like is upper triangular here, and you can kind of think of it like you can just then directly read off like x1 is z1, and then like x2 is z1 plus z2, but because z1 you can back out z2, and then like so on. So yeah, I feel like there are some deep connections between just even like 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 linear equations and row elimination and so on, and like how we can like back out solutions in that like undetermined case, and like how we can bring that to these kind of like sparse Jacobian structures and so on. Sorry, that was sort of a very rambly answer, but yeah, I feel like paying attention to these kind of old papers is might be very fruitful for thinking about the more difficult case for sure. Yeah, Carl Rowe and a co-author of his have this very cool paper in JRSSB as well on vintage factor analysis is identifiable, and basically they show that PCA plus some like Varimax rotation, they people have been doing it in psychometrics and factor analysis for years and years and years, without any theoretical justification. And they like prove that, okay, this is in fact identifiable. And they have some like conditions on the these kind of leptokurtic or almost sparsity conditions on like the Lowndes matrix and the factors and stuff. And yeah, I feel like those sparsity conditions like connect to the anchors in a way. Like if you have these really heavy tailed distributions, then the possibility that like one dimension is like far bigger than the others is almost like this anchoring kind of assumption. And so yeah, there's definitely, I think, some interesting connections there to be explored as well. But yeah, again, sorry, that was extremely rambly, but yeah, no, this stuff is very cool, and yeah.
No, that's good. I think I asked the question in a very in a very way, but maybe I'll just add one point to the to assuming things are upper triangular or whatnot. It's the whole
Mhm.
thing is you're sort of, I guess, you're assuming the first dimension is the first observed dimension or something like that is only the function
Mhm.
of the first random
Yeah.
and that introduces this like kind of arbitrary ordering,
Yeah.
which I guess it depends on how you interpret the latents in all
Mhm.
honesty, it doesn't really matter. But then when you introduce this triangular thing, at least, then you're sort of saying the first observed dimension is just, it's a one-to-one transformation of
Mhm.
latent, which does put some, I guess, observability implications on that. But anyways, there's like a ordering thing there that's hard to justify sometimes.
Oh
Um,
yeah, you're totally right. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, I have one more concrete question, which is you had a slide about the covariance of X
Hmm.
at some point using that to identify anchors.
Hmm.
Um, I'm just wondering, like on a technical level, would something like independence instead of using a linear covariance type of thing, uh, I guess I was expecting something like that to be required in this nonlinear case instead of just using covariance. I guess
Hmm.
can you comment a little bit on why a linear measure of covariance still works to grab the anchors?
Totally. Yeah, yeah. So this is where that assumption that the anchors have the same mapping comes into play. Um, so that's why we can consider just this covariance. And I guess because we're like fine up to coordinate wise transform, like that's why we can consider it, and like having this like the same form of the mapping then like gives us the structure that we can pin out. So yeah, that's a great question. I originally wanted to do some general kind of like, yeah, like mutual information or something like that. The math gets like very unwieldy at that point. But I think that, yeah, that's definitely, it'd be cool to see if this kind of proof technique can be extended to those kind of situations where you're considering more general forms of dependence among your features in order to back out like anchors and that kind of thing. But yeah, no, that's a great question, and yeah, that's why we had this same mapping assumption. Uh yeah, so
Yeah.
mhm,
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
mhm, mhm. But yeah, no, that's I that would definitely be a cool direction to go in. Like, does yeah, kind of like think about mutual information or different kind of things. Like, how much can we relax in that point and still use this kind of anchor idea to get identifiability?
Question for Gemma and Johnny. Could we convince either of you to either do this yourself or suggest someone to give us like a history of like a sort of 1950s version of this? Like there are these techniques, and I think many of us are just not aware of, and a history
Mm-hmm.
of this. I don't know. If you can think of it, it would be really nice. It
Yeah.
would be a really nice talk. Just like how did people do this in psychometrics, or what are the various approaches
Mm-hmm.
to this problem that predated kind of nonlinear ICA or predated ICA even. Um, um,
Mm-hmm.
what are the various techniques? How do they work?
Yeah.
The assumptions.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I would love that. I feel like so I mentioned Carl Rowe. I feel like he would give a great talk on this because the vintage factor analysis paper that I mentioned like is a wonderful paper that goes into some of the history of these kind of methods and the kinds of structure that people in psychometrics were looking for and that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, like I feel like he would be a great person to give a talk on that paper as well as like providing this historical context that like led up to this paper and that kind of thing.